thrilled to give this introduction in turn to such an eminent contributor to transgender and sexuality studies. I'm going to introduce Dr. Jules GILL-PETERSON. So Dr. Jules GILL-PETERSON is going to give a presentation entitled Street Queens and the Promise of Intersectional Trans Studies. She's a scholar of transgender history and the history of sexuality, focusing on racial histories of sex, gender, and trans embodiment, spanning both institutional and vernacular science and medicine. She is the author of Histories of the Transgender Child from University of Minnesota Press in 2018. The book was a recipient of a Lambda Award, a Lambda Literary Award for Transgender, and is also, a recipient of a Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Nonfiction and the Children's Literature Association Book Award. The book was the first to challenge the myth that transgender children are a new phenomenon in the 21st century. Drawing on a century's work of medical archival evidence, History of the Transgender Child establishes not just that trans children have a verifiable history, but that their presumed gender plasticity was in fact central to the development and racialization of transgender medicine. Dr. GILL-PETERSON has been featured and written about the histories comprising the book in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Lily, and on CNN. She's currently working on a book project entitled A Trans History of DIY that reframes post-1945 transgender history by strategically foregoing the medical archive and turning to the do-it-yourself DIY to illuminate long, illegible trans histories at the margins of the social without institutional medicine, legality, or state recognition. Dr. GILL-PETERSON serves as the general co-editor of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly. She is the recipient of research fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the chair in transgender studies at the University of Victoria, and the Kinsey Institute for Sexological Research. She was awarded a Chancellor's Distinguished Research Award from the University of Pittsburgh in 2020. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jules GILL-PETERSON.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. That was a very generous introduction, and just wanted to say hi to everyone out there in Zoom land. I'm seeing lots of familiar names, but also people who I'm looking forward to having a chance to get to know over the next few days as I pop in and out of panels as I can. So thank you all for being here. I couldn't be more excited, and I want to jump in to give us as much time as possible to talk. But I just wanted to say one thing up front, which I'll elaborate on more Friday if you're coming to the workshop that we're putting on, which is just that, I think I don't want to undersell how important, this year's conference theme is. I think Thinking Gender, if I'm remembering correctly, is one of the first conferences I ever presented at when I was a babe in graduate school many moons ago. Well, not that many moons ago. But, to see the conference theme this year put trans studies in central focus, including trans scholars and trans people of color, is a really meaningful development. And I'm really grateful to UCLA and to CSW and for everyone involved for making that possible. And I just want to say that I feel a deep honor sharing this space with all of you. And I'm so grateful for your presence, for your scholarship, and for your work that in many ways is work that I couldn't have even imagined being able to do as myself in graduate school. So thank you all. And I just wanted to offer that as we get going on this little journey this afternoon. So let me share my slides. I've got a relatively, hopefully, brisk talk, and then we'll start chatting with Mel Chen and with some of the organizers and with all of you. So this is Street Queens and the Promise of Intersectional Trans Studies. In the faded, sun-stroked Los Angeles of the late 1950s, a lone wolf appears on the horizon of Pershing Square. There we go. This small public park in LA's notorious downtown Vice District is abuzz with the thick atmosphere of a newly setting June sun. As this man surveys the square city block before him, he inventories the ensemble cast gathered for their daily sundown rituals. In one corner, a Black woman is sweating in woolly taupe, preaching to exhaustion of sin and repentance. Within earshot of her, a clutch of street kids snicker and banter in grubby clothes, chewing on the ends of long finished smokes. A few straight commuters, late for their streetcars, trot through the square, eyes ever forward on their destinations. And on the opposite end of the park is a small makeshift shed, on the side of which two policemen lean lazily but watchfully. Despite the flurry of activity, the soundscape of Pershing Square remains oddly muted. Only to the trained eye of the solitary man now perched on the street corner is the subaltern life or subterranean life of the park detectable. Slim, wiry figures are camping out here and there, so casual in their tableau as to look effortless, propped up against benches, water fountains, and bushes. They could be waiting for a bus or for a friend, suspicious only in their perfected casual innocence. Around them forms a ring, though at a noticeable distance, of much older figures, all men. Dressed more conventionally as if they had just left the office, they are caught in the strange paradox of looking so generically normal that they are out of place. They have come here to seek out someone like our lone wolf. They have come to find a young man in Pershing Square. Young man is the novelist John Recky's term of endearment for the masses of male hustlers that populate the vast American city of night of his eponymous 1963 novel. Stretching from Times Square on the East Coast to New Orleans on the Gulf and over to Pershing Square in the Californian West, Recky's gay modernism has long been lauded for its unflinching portrait of the sexual underground before the Stonewall riots. City of Night is loosely autobiographical, following one such young man, a Chicano from the borderlands of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, who leaves his mother behind for the relentless, solitary life of a hustler. As an emblem of what the mid-century would call trade, our protagonist isn't queer as the novel would understand it. Like countless other young, fit, and anonymous men who filled cities like LA after World War II, his sexuality is economic, not an identity. He has sex with men exclusively for money, looking down on the queers in search of unpaid dates, relationships, and happily ever after. He's a drifter, moving from city to city with a beatnik wanderlust straight out of Kerouac, an irrepressible need to seek something he thinks he will never find. The balm for a lonely spirit in a soulless America. He arrives in LA and to Pershing Square Park anonymous, without a place to live or any plan to do other than what he knows best, which is to hustle. This young man is the famed gay outlaw. Long before the era of gay marriage and corporate pride parades, the cities of post-war America generated the solo gay man as a kind of fugitive, always on the run from the cops and without anywhere to rest in the era of the suburbs, leave it to beaver and meaningless office jobs and skyscrapers. The gay outlaw took his expulsion as a badge of honor. He was framed by a conservative public as a menace to society, a would-be sexual predator, or a dangerous street criminal. In the heavily policed era before Stonewall, the gay outlaw was the symbol of cool dissent. Leaving behind the stultifying world of 1950s America, he may have been only as free as the change in his pocket from his most recent score, but his destiny was his own. If he could avoid the police and if he could avoid the truth of his deep loneliness, he answered to no one. Of course, this is sort of a fantasy, that version of the romantic gay outlaw that's been very compelling to a number of people for, at least as many decades as this book has been out. What could be more antisocial than to be a male hustler, giving up family, regular work, and normal society for an illegal and furtive life lived out in public parks, vice bars, and after-hour joints? What could be further from the idea of gay community than an economy of cheap sex work and cheaper drugs? Weren't gay outlaws in the heavily closeted Cold War era of McCarthyism the ultimate self-made men, bravely choosing themselves over the death sentence of conformity? The thing is, that's not really what happens to this young man. Not long after City of Night's protagonist arrives in Pershing Square, he is swept up by the arrival of the park's grande dame, a queen named Miss Destiny. Recchi paints a wild portrait of Destiny, a sort of composite figure made of half-truths and spectacular lies, but also ultimately basing her on a real queen that he knew, who you see here featured in a One magazine cover from 1964. But as a queen in the novel, Destiny is kind of a kaleidoscope, much larger than life. One day she lays on a thick Southern accent, and the next day she's from Pennsylvania. One day she explains that she got her name Destiny from a rich daddy, but in her next breath, he was actually a poor truck driver. She claims nearly every piece of trade in LA is her ex-husband, but also dreams of settling down and getting married. A real wedding is what she wants, quote, like every young girl should have at least once. One where she will descend a grand staircase in a Hollywood Hills house and where champagne and cake will be served after the ceremony. Miss Destiny is a street queen, a trans femme who gives Pershing Square its life and its authenticity. Like Marsha P. Johnson on Christopher Street, thousands of miles away in New York City, Miss Destiny is the patron saint of this outpost in the gay underworld. She dazzles the young men who have flocked to LA to make it, taking them in and teaching them what it takes to survive, but also how to live larger than life itself. She is royalty. As a trans femme, she has two bodies, and she claims to transcend the material world, but she is also its lowly symbol, its stigmatized calling card. Miss Destiny reigns in Pershing Square like Marsha reigns in the village, and it is in their image that the hopes and dreams of the gay world will rise and fall, both in the pages of City of Night and in the real world. The hot, cramped, and overly peopled streets, dives, and apartments of downtown LA or Manhattan breathe in and out with the dialectic of the queen's exaltation and her inevitable fall from grace. I'm interested in the idea that the gay world has had its queens, that trans femininity is forever entangled with gay men's urban life in the US. I think that some of the dilemmas, antagonisms, and schisms of the era that Recchi documents are actually still with us. Today, a trans woman and a gay man are seen as different species, one defined by that thing called gender identity, the other by sexuality, as in orientation. We are asked to assemble under an acronym, a tense world barely held together by those letters LGBT, with its ritual combat every June, when we are supposed to pay homage to how much the first three of those letters owe the last. But that revisionist history, the narrative that serves the ends of US identity politics, has very little to say about queens. They end up as metaphors, campy expressions, or relics of an era now apparently anachronistic, when gay men were maybe less sure of their distance from trans femininity. But I don't think we're done with the problem of what I might call the essential trans femininity of gay culture. It has merely been remade time and time again since the era of Miss Destiny's reign over Pershing Square or Miss Marsha's over Christopher Street. In academic gender studies, the drama might play out in two acts that we could subtitle first, queer betrayal, and second, intersectionality's redemption. In Act 1, queer theory decided that trans femininity was an allegory, not a real way of life. By reading trans femininity as the central metaphor for how gender is performative or how queer ironies are the true measure of political radicalism, early queer theory used trans femininity as its theory of gender, but sold out actual trans women as that theory's collateral damage. And the most dramatic entry in this bibliography is no doubt Judith Butler's 1996 book Bodies That Matter, where Butler reads Jenny Livingston's popular 1990 documentary about the Black and brown ball culture of New York City, Paris is Burning. Of course, Butler was writing at the time against a rash of pretty shallow readings of gender trouble, which had already been boiled down by some to the idea that gender is just a voluntary performance, essentially no different from doing drag. Understandably frustrated, Butler proposed that Paris is Burning depicts the limitations of subverting gender norms, the places where performance can actually rigidify oppressive power structures rather than soften them. And for the role of that failure, Butler cast Venus Extravaganza, a trans femme of color and one of the subjects of Livingston's documentary, who was murdered before the film's release. Butler pounced on Extravaganza's death as the primary evidence for their argument that, quote, sometimes a fatally subversive appropriation takes place, end quote, instead of a politically queer one. In so many words, Butler blamed Extravaganza for her own death. For Butler, Extravaganza's murder at the hands of a male client was also her tragic miscalculation, the cost of wanting to be a real woman, her very unqueer, unironic desire. Wanting to be with a man, wanting wealth and security, those were desires that Extravaganza was expected to refuse because it was her job to be a model of queer radicalism as a street queen and a sex worker. In refusing to give up the sincere desire to be real, Butler suspected that she would inevitably die for it. Her desire was too unrealistic, too much the stuff of fantasy to ever work out. Unlike the campy queer drag queen that so many readers plucked out of Gender Trouble, Extravaganza was supposed to reveal the wishful thinking of a naive politics of performativity. Of course, Butler was roundly critiqued by trans critics at the time, but it's really the vicious dismissal of Extravaganza's desire for realness that still stings me all these decades later, even though Judith Butler has become a very important defender of trans women. Now, Venus Extravaganza, writes Butler, she seeks a certain transubstantiation of gender in order to find an imaginary man who will designate a class and race privilege that promises a permanent shelter from racism, homophobia, and poverty. Why does Butler repeat her name Venus twice? It's not just Butler who acts this way. Bell Hooks' 1992 essay, Is Paris Burning?, makes the same kind of move. Hooks calls Extravaganza Venus throughout the essay while reserving the honorific of a last name for the film's director, Livingston. Strewn across all the pages written about Paris Burning is a very old wound, one with the name Venus. That name Venus is the one that Saidiya Hartman finds at the root of a certain style of thinking about Black women and violence in the wake of slavery. A pervasive and shadowy placeholder, Venus is commonly an empty name, sometimes the only thing human attributed to enslaved women in available archives. And while Extravaganza is not that Venus in important ways, she still bears the name by choice. One cannot ask who is Venus, writes Hartman, because it would be impossible to answer such a question. There are hundreds of thousands of other girls who share her circumstances, and these circumstances have generated few stories. And the stories that exist are not about them, but rather about the violence, excess, mendacity, and reason that seized hold of their lives, transformed them into commodities and corpses, and identified them with names tossed off as insults and crass jokes, end quote. By seizing on her murder as an allegory, Butler and also Hooks wanted Venus Extravaganza to be unknowable in that way, as if she were just some wayward soul caught up in the vast oceans of history of race and gender in the Americas. Extravaganza is meant to be just another Venus in a long history of that name, an object lesson to a queer reader. But in truth, she says more than enough on screen. Extravaganza introduces herself with a laugh, saying in her unmistakably soft voice, I would like to be a spoiled, rich white girl because they get what they want whenever they want it. They don't really have to struggle. Lying in her bed, she looks directly at the camera as she explains, I don't feel that there's anything mannish about me, except maybe what I might have between me down there. I guess that's why I want a sex change, she says with the simplicity of confidence, to make me complete. She tells the camera a story of moving to New York as a teenager, meeting the house of Extravaganza, and being offered a home without even having to walk a ball. Venus also pays tribute to her house father, Hector. On her 15th birthday, Hector took Venus to the West Village and threw a party where she met, quote, a lot of drag queens, transvestites that I didn't believe were trans because they were so beautiful. And that kind of sunk into my head, end quote. Far from a tragedy foretold by unrealistic fantasy, Extravaganza came out as a trans teenager in the original sense of that phrase, coming into a pre-existing community that cared for her and gifted her a way to be in the world. There's nothing wishful about Extravaganza's reflections on sex work either. She points out that her petite size, her light skin, and blonde hair are all assets in a misogynist and racist economy of sex. She knows this because of the clients like the one who touched her in between her legs and, quote, totally flipped out, screaming, "You fucking faggot, you're a freak. You're a victim of AIDS and you're trying to give me AIDS. What are you, crazy? You're a homo. I should kill you." Terrified for her life, Extravaganza grabbed her bag and jumped out the window. She tells Livingston that she now prefers to go out on dates. In fact, she had one the night that they were taping. After cocktails, he would probably buy her a dress or maybe some jewelry, quote, so that the next time he sees me, he'll see me looking more and more beautiful, the way he wants to see me. But I don't have to go to bed with them or anything like that. Butler faults Extravaganza for the fantasy of a nice home with a man far away from the city, somewhere no one knows she is trans. But Butler ignores that she contextualizes that desire as defiance of a double standard. Quote, if you're married to a woman in the suburbs, a regular woman who's married to a husband and she wants him to buy her a washer and dryer set, in order for him to buy that, I'm sure she'd have to go to bed with him anyway to give him what he wants, for her to get what she wants. So in the long run, it all ends up the same way, end quote. Venus Extravaganza doesn't apologize for her desire because she refuses the trans misogyny and racism that demonizes only her for wanting what cis women and white women are told is their birthright. I want this, she says. This is what I want, and I am going to go for it. The camera lingers on her at sunset on the West Side piers, smoking a cigarette, relaxing, talking to a friend, effortlessly beautiful and radiant, as a sister from her house explains the circumstances of her death. But only someone that sees no future for women like Extravaganza would ignore her sophisticated explanation on screen of the conditions of her life. So that was Act 1, but in Act 2 of our drama, Queer of Color theory, followed closely, I think, in many ways by Trans Studies, has tried to reclaim and rescue the trans femme of color, rescue the street queen from her pitiable abjection. But it has done so by idealizing her as the proper model of intersectionality, which I judge to be very little improvement at all. The street queen appears this way in one of the foundational texts of queer color studies, Roderick Ferguson's Aberrations in Black. A book that you might recall opens with a, quote, Black drag queen prostitute, a passing figure from a scene in Marlon Riggs's 1989 art film Tongues Untied. But why in a film that is deeply important as a statement about Black gay men does Ferguson turn to the one brief appearance of a trans femme? This woman appears midway through Tongues Untied. As she wanders a public space and smokes a cigarette, an Essex Hemphill poem is read as a voiceover. We learn very little of who she is or what her relationship to the rest of the Black men in the film might be. But Ferguson values her appearance for what it figures, asking if Queer of Color critique, quote, what mode of analysis would be appropriate for interpreting the drag queen prostitute as an image that allegorizes and symbolizes that social heterogeneity, end quote, of Black life in general. It's those words allegorize and symbolize that are key. Aberrations in Black is not about what this Black trans femme knows or does with the situation of her life, but rather uses her as the precondition for critiquing racial capitalism and establishing intersectional queer studies. Once she has served her purpose in the first few pages of the book, she disappears altogether, much like we're led to believe happens in the film. But mystifying the Black trans femme requires refusing to look at Tongues Untied more closely, just as Butler or Hooks refused to look at Paris is Burning more closely. In a 1991 interview in After Image magazine, Marlon Riggs spoke at length about why he cast this femme, a lifelong drag performer from San Francisco who went by many names. Riggs understood her function to be iconic. And this is a quote. I think he represents an icon that we as Black gay men, we as gay men, we as people in general tend to dissociate ourselves from. As gay men, we're othered by dominant straight society, as Black men by white society, and yet as if to establish our own dominance, our status, we have to other someone else. Drag queens become the baseline beyond which we can't go because that's really abject, end quote. By pairing the Black trans femme's appearance with the Hemphill poem, Homicide, which was dedicated to a murdered femme friend, Riggs explained that he meant to, quote, invest the drag queen with a very dignified humanity. And when the interviewer asked if the, quote, the transvestism in the piece actually speaks about the possible sexual vulnerability of all Black gay men, Riggs agreed that she represents something for the audience, that she responds to, quote, a very visceral need to be loved, as well as a sense of abject loneliness of life where nobody loves you. The Black femme's appearance in Tongues Untied is hardly as opaque or fleeting as Ferguson's reading implies, yet once again, she is primarily meaningful for everyone who is not her. Her trans femininity and street life make meaning for Riggs as an artist, for Black gay men, for gay men writ large, and for the audience, rather than drawing us closer to her. But by the same token, Riggs joins a chorus of gay interlocutors, artists, and writers, including John Recke and perhaps Rod Ferguson, along with many queer scholars who have been fascinated, compelled, and terrified of trans femininity's relationship to themselves and to their work. Riggs suggests that the gay male imaginary has been one of the principal sites for imagining the trans femme as queen. So what I want to move us towards asking today ultimately is this. What if we were to embrace the entanglement of gay men and trans femininity by way of the queen's sovereignty in the gay world? What if the street queen is not a metaphor, not an allegory, not a theoretical prop, and not a vehicle for intersectional idealization, but a name attached to a real, socially consequential person in the cities of the mid-century and afterwards? So with my remaining time, let me offer some of my emergent thoughts on what it might mean to say that trans femininity, and more difficultly, I think, poor trans women of color actually reign as queens of the gay world. So my proposal is admittedly provocative, or actually kind of just a bit camp. I want to suggest that we read Esther Newton's classic 1960s ethnography, Mother Camp, alongside kind of arch conservative Ernest Kantorowicz's pretty dry study of the metaphysics of monarchy, the king's two bodies. So that's weird, but stick with me. I think it's worth the trouble, and we'll find our way to the conclusion. So Newton makes it really clear in Mother Camp that trans femininity symbolizes the social situation of the mid-century homosexual. The drag queen is the purest incarnation of the stigma of effeminacy that marks all queer people. The queen is the one who defies cultural stigma by unflinchingly embracing effeminacy. She's the only one who makes an actual career out of being gay. Yet Newton's ethnographic work also establishes that the queen does not so reign in an absolute or uncontested sense. Rather, Newton attends to the deep class and race hierarchies within the gay world that actually make a major distinction between stage performers, aka professional drag queens, and street queens. Whereas the professional drag queen is lionized for her campy wit, her exaggerated glamour, and her self-aware mocking performance, the street queen is generally reviled as the lowest of the low, what Newton terms the underclass of the gay world. Street impersonators, she writes, are never off stage. Their way of life is collective, illegal, and immediate. Its central experiences are confrontation, prostitution, and drug highs. Even in an underworld of so-called deviance where everyone is to some degree criminalized, it is the sincere street queens who actually try to live as women who are punished for what is celebrated when it is an act on stage, femininity. This doubly so if the street queen is Black or brown. One professional drag queen that Newton interviewed put it pretty plainly, quote, I think what you do in your bed is your business. What you do in the street is everybody's business. poor trans femmes made the rest of the gay world look bad by daring to go all the way with the stigma of effeminacy and say, okay, fine, I'll actually become a woman. But as Newton notes, by the same token, she wasn't surprised when she found out that it was the street queens who led the riot at Stonewall in 1969. Street fairies, as she puts it in the second preface to this book, have nothing to lose. It is this classed situation of living at the very bottom of even the gay underworld that ironically grants the trans femme queen her clarity of vision and purpose, her capacity to rule as queen. In Larry Mitchell's lyrical work, The Faggots and Their Friends Between the Revolutions, the queens are thus described as those who, quote, dress in those parts of the devastated city which the men have abandoned. In the spaces created by ruined buildings, the queens have made a dazzling new world. It's all trickery, of course, fabrics and dim lights and soft pillows and tinkly sounds and sweet smells and laughter everywhere as the queens dress for the streets. The queens live on the streets. They eat off the streets. They conduct their business in the streets. They have their love affairs on the streets. They make the men on the streets very uncomfortable, sometimes even violent. It amuses the queens to see the men in such a state. And indeed, this is what Recky's novel, Newton's ethnography, Paris's Burning, and Tongues Untied all show us. Poor trans women, often Black and brown, are the glue of the gay world, the caretakers, the ones who do the social reproduction of providing housing, food, love, and a place to call our own. So if the gay world is an urban underworld, if it is a world hidden within the straight world of America, then it needs its own queen. And if the phrase the gay world indeed refers to rough neighborhoods structured around the material disadvantages created by stigma, then what makes the world gay is not a shared identity, but a shared precarity. The gay world is for those who cannot hold down a job, who live itinerant, vagrant, and proletarian lives. And it makes sense then that the queens who can't work formally as women, let alone as men, are right there with the boys and men leading them. Poverty and the police are the structuring characteristics of working class gay life. And in those communities, the queens assume a dual role worthy of their name. So it's not a metaphor. Queen here actually follows its etymology. It bears a meaning first spelled Q-U-E-A-N in the early modern era, where a queen was what, maybe the poet and early modern writer Chaucer might have called a hussy. Queen in this sense married the idea of a noblewoman to a prostitute, right? And that term sort of, continues on, but, finds its modern gay usage by the late 19th century. The street queen, the trans femme queen, the queen of the working class gay world is this sort of doubled figure. The queen is she who reanimates high culture in low places, often through camp, but always with a purpose: to hold the pain and material insufficiency of the present in tension with a grander promise of uplift and exaltation. The promise of one day hustling hard enough to make it, something perhaps the ballroom femme queens have made the realist. And in this sense, the queens have an idealizing function, like Miss Destiny, who prances around Pershing Square and the bars, instructing her flock with poorly quoted Shakespeare references. The refinement of the queen is about striving to overcome the degradation, the insult, and the stigma of underclass lives. And here it is that the queen, much like the king of Kantorowicz's dusty old study, has two bodies. The trans feminine predilection for transubstantiation, for becoming out of a man, a glamorous woman, is in effect the proof that she is more than mortal. She is metaphysical. Kantorowicz calls this the political theology of sovereignty that came into force all the way back in the Tudor era in England. The strange notion under the law that the king had not simply a human body, but also an immortal dynastic body that outlived him and ensured not merely the continuation of the monarchy from ruler to ruler, but a bunch of much weirder things. It is the king's second political body, that incorporated metaphorically his subjects into him, held them in trust as in the law, and made them all one. A 15th century legal commentator suggested quite literally that in the king's body politic, quote, he is the head and the people are the members. In this peculiar arrangement, the king's two bodies allowed for all the mere mortals of the realm to be uplifted by being governed, to be incorporated into his immortality and beneficence, his angelic quality on earth. For unlike the king's natural body, his body politic was invincible. And tantalizingly for us, this specific old legal doctrine has its roots in a 14th century Latin concept that translates as the worthier draws itself to the less worthy, which was originally employed in cases involving intersex people. Whichever sex was observed to predominate in someone's body was the one recognized by law. As Kantorowicz puts it, quote, what fitted the two sexes of an hermaphrodite fitted juristically also the two bodies of a king. And so I see no accident here that poor trans femmes, especially those who were Black and brown, were the veritable queens of the gay worlds, being magicians themselves of sex and gender. For they alone bore the fullest volume of the social stigma of effeminacy, especially in its racialized tones, but yet they managed to turn that hatred into gold, into becoming stunning, smart, and powerful women. The queen was the only one strong enough to rule over her gay subjects, yet for the same reason, she was reviled, for she could never deliver on the promise of a good life for everyone. The queen was also, as Mother Camp shows in excruciating detail, a symbol of perpetual failure. In the same way trans women are clocked and deprived of the experience of being recognized as women, in the same way that their culture betrays their two bodies, so too could they not deliver transcendence to their subjects, who have so often then turned on them, villainized them, and blamed them, like when Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were violently kicked out of the gay liberation movement they helped found. When Miss Destiny risks having her dream wedding in City of Night, no one shows up, afraid the cops will raid and arrest everyone for the Queen's cross-dressing. As a result, no one in Pershing Square knows what happened to her afterwards when she disappears. Was she in exile? A queen imprisoned? A queen cannot, after all, really leave her realm. As a patron saint, she is tied forever to the dirt and rubble of those vice districts gay men and trans women both called home in the mid-20th century. But as the strange alchemy of metaphysics, transubstantiation, and mundane material circumstances of policing and poverty, I hope show, this means that the relationship of trans women to gay men isn't strictly speaking about identity. It's not even an intersection of two identities. Looking back at this period for guidance on today's frictions and struggles, what strikes me isn't that it's hard, though it's obviously not easy either, to draw clear lines between gay men and trans women. What stands out as far more important to me is that gay men and trans femmes had a shared material precariousness, a shared vulnerability that they did not bear evenly, but thrust them into the same world, the titular City of Night. There, they eked out a living and plotted their fight back by crowning the queen as the dual symbol of being set free on the one hand and falling into the seventh circle of hell on the other. The preservation of that difficult dialectic, that profound entanglement of homosexuality and trans femininity through the stigma of effeminacy and its various racializations suggests at a bare minimum that what we are owed today, as in the 1950s, is simply to learn to struggle together, to live up to the street queens, not because they were tragic figures or perfect goddesses, but precisely because they have had to actually live under the extreme weight of carrying the tension between material poverty and grandiose exaltation, between making it and hitting rock bottom, between freedom and self-destruction. Heavy is the head that wears the crown indeed, but if I am right about the function of the queen, then her body is most importantly incorporated as our body, collectively. We all bear the burden and responsibility of gay life together. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Jules. That was absolutely incredible. I have a lot of thoughts in my head, but I'm just going to move along and introduce Dr. Mel Y-Chen, who's going to be in conversation with Dr. GILL-PETERSON. Dr. Mel Y-Chen is an associate professor of gender and women's studies and the director for the Center of the Study of Sexual Culture at the University of California, Berkeley. Previously, they served as the Robert Sterling Clark Visiting Professor of Art History at Williams College and the Mathieson Visiting Professor of Gender and Sexuality at Harvard University. Their 2012 book, Animacies, Biopolitics, Racial Matterings, and Queer Affect from Duke University Press won the MLA GLQ Caucus Alan Bray Award, and it explores questions of racialization, gender, queering, disability, and effective economies, and animate and inanimate concept of animacy. CHEN's second book project, which they are now completing, concerns the conceptual territories of toxicity and intoxication, and their involvement in 19th century archival histories of the interanimation of race and disability. The writing on the racialization and transing of pollution, cognitive disability and method, transmedia, gender pronouns and linguistics, and more can be found in the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, Transgender Studies Quarterly, Discourse, Women in Performance, Australian Feminist Studies, Science, the Medical Humanities, South Atlantic Quarterly, and GLQ, as well as a number of arts catalogs and scholarly anthologies. CHEN co-edits a Duke University Press book series entitled Anima, Highlighting Scholarship in Critical Race and Disability, Post and Humanisms. They're also part of a small and sustaining queer and trans of color arts collective in the San Francisco Bay Area. So thank you very much to both of you for being in conversation. I'm going to just hand it right over because I think everyone's excited to hear it. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Rana, for that wonderful introduction. And hi, Jules. Honestly, I'm going to be honest with you. My heart is beating so hard. I've read this talk, and right now I just want to lie down and sort of let my heart slow down because it was such a beautiful and deep and significant talk. Kind of holding back my tears. It models so many things that, yeah, I hope you and I, in these few minutes, and maybe everyone attending can talk about later. I think that the chat sort of blew up, and I think a lot of us are feeling this. So just first of all, thank you so much for this and for all the work that you do. I count myself as a huge fan, and we've only met once, but I'm just feeling a lot of gratitude right now.
Thank you.
So yeah, I just like, there's so many notes I have on your keynote. There's so much I want to ask, but I also don't want to rush this conversation. And I think your talk asks us not to rush and maybe, you know, I think rushing into the habits of scholarship is maybe one of the problems that you're diagnosing here, and the affects of scholarship, which I hope we can talk about. But you know, first, I wondered if we could just talk a little bit, just centered on the conference theme, talk a bit more about intersectionality, since it does play this huge role in your talk. And I think we're all learning from the kinds of practices you're offering us. And I'll just quote what I think is like a related segment of many in the talk to ground us, and you needn't use it, but you know, you write, the trans woman of color is so often like the Black from Tongues Untied, a performative subject whose presence is merely aesthetic or evocative, rather than being a person or even a full-fledged historical actor beyond a symbolic register. I feel like you make this clear in so many ways. And then you do this amazing work to address the deployment of this performative subject by Butler and then by queer of color theorists, which is the really important provocation. And I think you arrive at this wholly different kind of relational configuration, right? I mean, you talk about incorporation between gay life and street queens, and I think racialized trans femmes more broadly. What if we were to embrace the entanglement of gay men and trans womanhood by way of the queen's sovereignty in the gay world? So I wonder if you could share a bit more about how you're thinking about intersectionality here. And actually its titular promise for your talk, right? You say the promise of intersectionality.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for reading one of the paragraphs that ended up cutting at the last minute, because I was nervous about, keeping to time here. And, there's a lot at hand for me, but I think that part of my central frustration is how much the consistent experience of poor trans women is to be used as theories, right? And, of course, I'm very indebted to really good writing on intersectionality. People like, just to cite one, Jennifer Nash's incredible book length, consideration of the real difficulties of trying to sort of, understand the gap between our sincere political desires that we bring to our work and just the sheer limit of the transformative potential of thinking and writing, in the university, right? And because poor trans women aren't in the university for the most part, that gap is, about this big, right? And, one thing I've been thinking about, right, is that I think one of the sort of problems that early queer theory created that we're still trying to figure out how to get out of is it fundamentally misunderstood what performance is, what the art of appearance is, and generally speaking, like much feminism, much of queer theory and much of trans studies is just anti-feminine. It doesn't like femininity, thinks femininity is ornamental, superficial, right? And so then if something is superficial, you could abstract it. It seems sort of available for abstraction. And so I think what has happened is in the early moment, right, you have Butler and other folks just really dismissing poor trans women as naive, as actual, just like people so hooked on fantasy that they die for it. I mean, it's like the most degrading reading ever. But then the solution to that, right, is actually just as abstract. It's to take the images, the performativity of these people, right, and then say, oh, well, these are great slogans, right? And this is not just something we do in the academy. I'm also like throwing shade at corporate pride and all of these sorts of, representational politics that are, we're watching how abjectly they're failing in real time right now in the world. But this sort of sense that the point of intersectionality is to find the most intersectional object to think about or write about, right? Which is absolutely not what the point of intersectionality ever was, but it is one of the ways it has kind of calcified over time, I think has led to this kind of, a sort of routinization of our relationship to trans women of color as the things that we just, they're slogans, they're pictures, right? They're sad stories, or they're uplifting stories, right? But they're just not actually, they're just actually so intensely objects. I think that is very much against the spirit of the kind of scholarship that intersectionality was supposed to bring us into, which is like, well, what about the marginalized subject position of those people who are being objectified, right? And so in some ways, it's like, I think of what I'm trying to do here as just listening better. Like, these archives are not great, obviously, but like, there's so much there, right? I was just shocked after coming back to Bodies That Matter and then just watching Paris is Burning. I was like, okay, well, it's not, I wouldn't have come to those conclusions, right? Even with Tongues Untied, all I had to find was one interview. Right? And you go back and read City of Night. I'm like, it's all written. Like, these women did all that work. It has just been actively dismissed, right, for political reasons. And I think the theoretical projects or the scholarly projects that have tried to resuscitate them haven't always been aware of that political violence, right? It actually took a lot of work for gay people to turn on trans women, right? They didn't really love them in the 60s in the era that Mother Camp is covering, but they still kind of acknowledged they were all stuck in it together. But then by the 70s, you really see gay men being like, actually, what if we were just men? Then we don't need you anymore, right? We might be able to cash in our chips and get recognized. What if we could be white? What if we could be men? What if we could be good capitalist citizens, right? But I think when we sort of, slow down and think about how our own intellectual formation is conditioned by that history, right? in many ways, I think one of the things I'm just stumped by, almost shocked by, right, is like, you know, I was trained to be a theoretical thinker, but it's like, I don't think any of the thinking I'm doing in this new work is especially complicated. It's just like so overdue, you know, like it is a continuation of a struggle from 1969, right? And I am just trying to channel that, you know, as much as it resonates for me personally, but also just like I see it everywhere. So I don't know if that's, you know, partially a way to answer your really thoughtful question.
I mean, so wonderful. I so love that you shared with us that you're feeling stumped, you know, about just sort of how we, and I guess I say the word we advisedly because I think there are many we's here, right? How we got here. And I think you are reminding me of, you know, I went back to Kimberly Crenshaw's 1989 article, just, you know, to see again the care that she takes, right, around Black women's lives, but also, you know, the ways that they become figured in the language of the law. And I see that same thrust of care and attention to what it really means to value a life, right? And I suppose, right, that isn't all that complicated or shouldn't be, right? But it becomes complicated in part because of how, you know, as you say, like in some ways, intersectionality has been institutionalized. And so what do we get, right, with institutionalization? We get the inheritances of white supremacy. We get the inheritances of kind of the deployment of objects for their use, right? Forms of imperialism. So I hear you. I feel both the shock and the, well, of course, you know, of these collisions. But I want to say, I think I feel that you take this immensity seriously, and I want to just, you know, add to the chorus of voices in the chat how much I appreciate this, you know, this for me an exemplar of the kind of work that we so desperately need more of. And I actually wondered if I could, you know, in our, oh gosh, it's already 1. Can I just throw in, because I think we're supposed to stop by now, but I wanted to just throw in, you know, some of your closing words that I'm still sitting with and that I actually, in some form or another, have been trying to sit with myself in my own work. But I love how, you know, you made it clear for us in a way, which is this tension that you actually just spoke to a little bit between living and living up to. In your closing words, you say, we need to live up to the street queens, not because they were tragic figures or perfect goddesses, but precisely because they've had to actually live under the extreme weight of carrying the tension between material poverty and grandiose exaltation, right? So I welcome your use of Dusty Kantorowicz, stigma and loss and abandonment when she cannot leave her realm. So what living up to means in scholarship, when lives, at least in part, also become materials, right? Even if we are recognizing them in their complex materialities. This is a praxis thing to me, and it's really immensely important to think with, and also to think with my students about. You mentioned drawing us closer to the actual lives of the Black trans women who populate some of these archives or who otherwise serve these functions. But yeah, so please, if you could say it just a bit more, living and living up to.
I love that. I felt so wondrously seen in you picking up on that line. And I really appreciate that. You know, this talk comes from a chapter of a book that I'm working on about the history of trans misogyny. And I go on much, much longer, you know, in that sort of ending section on Miss Destiny's life and what I think these queens are teaching us, right? And here's sort of the contradiction maybe we can chew on as we open up towards the audience here. And I'm very eager to hear what people think, right? And part of this comes from I would say the origin of this thought comes from me trying to show up as myself in my work, right? Where I was like, basically like, damn, academic theory is so secular and it's so like unenchanted and impoverished. So no wonder we have all these weird new materialisms and silly kind of, white people's fantasies about, matter is doing this stuff. I'm like, yeah, okay, it's because like Western rationalism just like ruins your experience of your own life. And like, as like a trans woman of color, like I constantly feel like that my actual like biological experience in the world is so incredibly informational in ways for which I have no language, right? And trans theory actually doesn't talk about that, right? Because it's not interested in that, it's only interested in the political, right? And so I always want to think about what other fields are we missing, right? And so here's the riddle, right? And I want to offer this riddle to everyone. The riddle will go something like this, right? On the one hand, I'm asking us to be critical about the political desires that we invest in our work, because sometimes we idealize or punish the people we write about for not living up to what we want from them or what we want out of the world. So that's one thing. I'm not asking us to abandon the political work that we're doing. That I would never, right? On the contrary, I think what I find so compelling about Street Queens is that they understand that politics and spirit go hand in hand, because that is the struggle they live. How would you turn male flesh into glamorous womanhood when you don't have access to hormones or surgery in the 1960s because you're hustling on the street, right? That is a political problem around which they organize, right? As sex workers, as trans liberation activists, as DIY transitioners, but it's also a spiritual matter of how are we going to break out of this gay world? How are we going to live the lives that we deserve, right? And so the Queen is not inviting us in many ways, right? The Queen is not asking us to give up our politics. She's asking us to understand that we too are bound spiritually in this struggle. And I think that is a bit of a riddle in that it's not clear to me what that means. I have lots of ideas, right? But I think there's a lot that, I hope that resonates for people. And I hope that reminds us that like, how we feel and how we care for one another and how we show up for one another has to be bigger than politics, in the sense that trans politics right now is mostly like, we got to save people's lives. And like, that's true, but it is so immiserating to be stuck in that space forever, right? And so trans studies has some institutional spaciousness to do more than just fight that basic line. Like, I don't need to know anything more about why trans people deserve to live and live well, right? Like, I already know that, the end, right? I don't need to know anything more about TERFs. I don't need to know anything more about anti-trans evangelicals. I get it. I see around everything they're doing. It's not very sophisticated. I'm ready for more, right? So I think that's partly where I'm inviting us to go, but I feel invited by the Queens, right? It's not even my intervention, but it just resonates really very deeply for me. Maybe that's a good transition point to bring in our co-facilitators who are going to bring us into a bigger Q&A moment here.
That's a perfect transition. So let me go ahead and introduce the Q&A portion of our program, and the two graduate students from UCLA who will first ask their own questions of the panelists and then facilitate the questions that have been submitted from the audience. So that these are our wonderful, part of our wonderful team, Sid Jordan and Angel de Luna Escobedo. So Sid Jordan is this year's Thinking Gender graduate student consultant and is a PhD candidate in the Department of Social Welfare. He's also a graduate student researcher with the UCLA Center for the Study of Women. His research examines social movement and collective organizing frameworks for transgender healthcare, as well as transformative responses to interpersonal and institutional violence. He's part of the Los Angeles-based group Transmasculine Health Justice and part of the new CSW-based community academic organizing effort on research ethics called Just Research, Transfutures in Health and Scientific Knowledge. And then also Angel. Angel, you're so lovely. In addition to being our TG22 conference coordinator, a master's student in social welfare and advocate for LGBTQ+ racial and gender justice, Angel also has a passion for integrating holistic healing modalities into her clinical work with the communities she works with. So with that, y'all take it away.
Whew. Okay, first of all, y'all took us to church today. Like I just, okay, that was really just, I'm very grateful that that Mel went first, because when Mel named the desire, like when they wanted to cry and all these emotions, I was like, that's me. I'm like, you go first, I can like, you know, let it like out on my own time, I guess. No, but I really like appreciate and deeply felt so much of what both of you and Jules in your talk, what you shared. Didn't realize how much it spoke to me and how healing it was to actually kind of hear you, because I read your talk, but hearing you have the best like voice also. Like you have a really good voice. I was like, oh, I feel like I'm like, you know, it's tea time and I'm just like hearing a story. Okay, but anyways, that's me being very long-winded, but I loved also that Mel brought up a very similar kind of question that we came up together, which is on the concept of the fetish of the visible. Even the quote was the same that we kind of alluded to. So this concept that struck me is the trans as theory, as opposed to lived or embodied experience. In the sense, and you spoke this, in the sense of a trans woman of color or Black trans woman who is rendered a performative subject whose presence is merely aesthetic or evocative rather than being a person or even a full-fledged historical actor, to be on a symbolic register. Would you be open to sharing how your critique informs your own approach or method? Or as you said it, what does it mean to attach a name to a real person?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I feel so silly now that I took out this paragraph that everybody was like, this is where we should talk. So apologies to everyone in the audience that you didn't get that paragraph at first, but you know, exactly, right? Like to me, I think, right, I'm not actually invested in an opposition between, say, theory and praxis. I actually think like the queens already figured that out a long time ago, and they are the ones, you know, if they have these two bodies that keep being basically cut in half, right? And so then they're being turned into theory, right? And so understandably, lots of people are like, well, then where's the practice? Where's the practice? Where's the practice? And that's the political recuperation, right? But I actually feel, and I'm being very like, yeah, mythological about it, but right, but like, you know, it's that those bodies need to be joined back together. There's a healing of spirit that also is about honoring. And I think naming, in so many cultures, of course, naming is the way that, you know, we do that work. And as trans people, often, you know, when we grant ourselves the gift and grace of a new name, right, it is to inaugurate something in the world that is not merely a, you know, is not just an ornament, right? It has force. And so I think that to me, right, part of how I understand, I mean, it's very interesting because in my first book, right, I was writing about medical archives, and in some ways it was a very easy, it was an awful but easy question, right? I would be like, oh, well, the archive isn't like, the archive is just a record of violence. So my job as steward, right, is to like reduce the amount of harm I'm recirculating as I think through the archive. But here's very different, right? Because these are people to whom I'm, in a different way, deeply, deeply attached. And I feel that they are my spiritual queens and my mothers too, right? Because some of them really are, you know, I feel myself in lineage with them and I want to respect them, but I also want to point out, right, that when we engage with them, right, I cannot make, even at the level of fantasy, Venus Extravaganza, Miss Destiny, right, or any of these other queens, I can't make them professors. That's not who they are. Right. And that was not the lives that they were able to live. So our job is not to pull them into the academy from the margins as if that were an innocent act. Right. I think our job is to revel in the power of their name and the work that they did, but then understand our limitation there. Right. And in some ways, it's just a call to be reflexive, to understand the limitations of what we are able to do. Right. And that's where I think Mel's phrase, what Mel underlined, the living up to. Right? It's a horizontal kind of gesture. I'm a very anti-utopian thinker in general, but like maybe that's something I share a little bit with queer utopianism in this one case, right? This idea of chasing after something that you know is worth it, because that's what those that's what those girls were doing back in the day, and what they, they never stopped trying to do. And it's us who have sort of fallen short of them. I mean, I think, I guess the one other thing I will say is, and I've been thinking a lot through this, right? Part of my frustration with so much secular theory and political theory is it's actually very Christian. It's actually all still about redemption, right? Because if you fall from grace, if trans women of color's mistreatment shows the sinfulness of the world we live in, right? But then in that kind of, messianic framework, we have to wait for the second coming, right? Which literally at this point, right, the corporate pride version is like the second coming of Sylvia and Marcia, like it's nonsense, right? That's not why they're not here. It's not, they didn't die on a cross. They were killed by the world, right? And so I think it's also about understanding that our work does not necessarily inaugurate a new world, nor need it in order to be about how we struggle right now on this earth. And that to me is what the Street Queens are about. They are attached to these real places, these neighborhoods that are peopled, right? And that have real material issues that are mostly about police, labor, right? And criminalization, right? And so those are things that we address now. We don't wait for a new world where there will be no police, right? We have to get rid of police here on this earth, right? So I don't know, that's some of the kind of language that I'm sort of trying to play with in order to help illustrate, I think, some of the work that I feel called towards. So I hope that's a helpful answer to your question.
No, that's definitely answers the question. And when you reflect, even another colleague and trans woman in the program, Vanessa, I don't know if you're here, like, hey, but she was kind of alluding to when you mentioned the methodologies that trans people have already been creating. I think of like the oral traditions, and like she was mentioning oral traditions, and like how like the dinners after a ball and the sharing of knowledge and safety. Don't talk to this person because this person in the car is a little sketchy. We've heard stories about this other one, and like that resource sharing and that knowledge sharing, that is like in some ways also like research, right? And so I really like kind of you drawing attention to that. And Sid.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. And just echoing all the gratitude that Angel said, and Mel, welcome back. Sorry that we lost you for a minute.
Internet homophobe. I'm glad.
No, I'm saying phobic, transphobic, racist, it's all the things.
No transphobic.
Very disrespectful.
Such an honor, but also so fun to be with you and to listen to your talk today. It was such a joy. And also, I'm just echoing whoever said in the chat that I just feel like I want to write notes furiously. Thank you. Angel and I had the chance to look at the talk also beforehand. So thank you so much for that. And yesterday we wound up having this conversation about it, and we were talking about this theme of the queen as caretaker. And this idea of taking care as survival, as social reproduction, but also, as you said it today, holding the pain of underclass lives, while also coming to sort of abstractly represent that pain. And then perhaps this other way that care shows up as a world-making practice that accrues this kind of status. There were a number of papers this year submitted to Thinking Gender that had sort of themes of care and care labor. And so I wondered if you, both of you, if you'd like, might elaborate or comment on the work that you see care or caretaking doing in your own work, or perhaps in trans studies or trans politics, and then also if there's limitations or trappings of those kinds of circulations that you might have something to say about.
Yeah, I mean, real quick, I think like we're living in this moment of care. It's become this like, I don't know, leftist watchword that I think is trying to fill in for a real sense that the floor fell out underneath us in the past couple of, I mean, it's been falling out underneath trans people and people of color for a long ass time. But, here we are multiple years into a pandemic where we're just watching on a mass scale how comfortable the state is, right, with letting massive amounts of people die, of course, but it always has been doing that. And, I think, I have some bristles with the kind of rapid increase in like care as a word that I think often is just standing in for things that are hard to talk about, right? And so, I think care is often invoked as in we know how to do it because our lives are hard and therefore we can just do it, right? And that's not really how it works, right? And like when I think back to the lessons of of the queens or the lessons of trans femmes who do care work, right, is that word work, you know, that really I want to underline. That care is not an unlimited resource, right? And it seems to me that one of the interesting problems that I'm trying to think through in my book, right, is that so much trans misogyny in the world is a refusal of many different kinds of people's originary dependency on trans women, right? So the men who are, you know, attracted to us, cheat on their wives with us, whatever, but then want to kill us afterwards because they can't acknowledge how dependent they are on trans men for their sense of masculinity and its potential undoing. But gay men too, right? How terrified they are that trans women represent the worst thing that could happen to you as a gay man, but actually becoming a woman, or the best thing that could happen to you. And that's very scary, right? You know, gender critical cannot stand to imagine that as white women, they could possibly share the earth with feminine creatures of Black and brown skin tones, right? All of these people that wish to violently sever that relation of dependency, it's also a severance and a kind of refusal of the debt that is incurred by that care work, right? Trans women do so much cultural labor for everyone, right? We would not have fashion models, we would not have Kardashians, right? We would not have straight men, we would not have gay men, we would not have RuPaul, we would not have all these things if it was not for the work that women did. And even in queer community, trans women are the one. Miss Destiny in City of Night is the person whose apartment everyone sleeps in, right? And she's teaching the girls how to do their faces, right? Marsha was a mother to so many trans women who taught them how to do this and how to do that, right? And so I just think, like, for me, care is work, it's labor, right? And so part of what is important about trans femininity's historical conditions of possibility is that when we say they have been criminalized, right? The reason trans women are associated with sex work is simply because they cannot do any other work, right? And you cannot, in a shitty capitalist society, it is your one option, right? And so there is a debt to be repaid. There is money that is not on the table that needs to be put back on there. There are receipts that need to be called in because they are being held by the dolls, right? And so all of these things that we actually often have as turns of phrases, right, that actually often exist as argot, and people dismiss as just like funny, right? I'm like, no, they're not actually metaphorical. They're all just real. And they actually all have a history. So I think care is really interesting, but I think care costs money, basically, is what I think. And care costs time, and care takes energy. It takes muscles, it takes brain power, it takes heart, it takes soul. And, you know, some of us have been used up a little bit more than others. So yeah, I guess that wasn't a very short answer, sorry.
No, it's like, I feel like all of these answers are just like making my brain race. It's like, oh my goodness, I have to think about this even more. No, I appreciate every word that comes out of your mouth, so don't even phone. Yeah. I think now we are gonna ask some Q&A questions from the audience.
Okay. Yeah.
We might only have time for a couple, but so the first one asks, thank you so much for this brilliant and beautiful talk and dialogue. In light of how you're thinking about and remembering Venus Extravaganza, I'm curious how you would think about Candy's final performance in the FX show, Pose, if you have seen it, in which, you know, spoiler alert, after her character's death, she comes back to life and does one final ballroom walk, lip singing to Stephanie Mills' song, I Never Knew Love Like This Before. And to a roaring crowd consisting of her community, affecting as it is, this person says, I feel ambivalent about it. And so, yeah, just kind of like your thoughts and any thoughts you might have about this.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I definitely have seen the episode, and yeah, I'm a huge fan of Angelica Ross, and have been lucky enough to be in a documentary film with her recently. And we were talking in a Q&A about that film, right, about her process. She's playing a Black trans woman from the 1950s named Georgia, who went to UCLA to the gender clinic there, or not to the gender clinic, but met with social scientists. And anyways, something she was talking about, Angelica, in her process was how she understood how to relate to different Black trans women in the past, like as oral history, that she felt not only an inheritance on some sort of phantasmatic level, but that it was real, that she knew these people because they had been handed down to her in community, right? And so they have a life. And so I think, you know, it's like, as difficult as Pose is for 100 reasons that have much more to do with FX and Ryan Murphy and like representation than they have to do with any of the brilliant Black women and trans women that were on that show or a part of that show, I actually think that performance is really interesting, right? I mean, it's really risky to reproduce the representation of Black trans women as killable by having an episode about someone dying, but they did it. But what I kind of think is so powerful then is that she does come back to life. She is larger than life. She does not die. I mean, she really does have two bodies in that sense. I think she is doing part of what I'm trying to, or what she is doing is part of what I'm trying to get at, right? That there is a kind of persistence, right, in performance. And I think there's really interesting testimony that some of the femme queens in ballroom have given, right? How to when they're out on the floor and they're doing floor routines or they're lip syncing or they're voguing or they're walking, right? It's not expressive as in the sense of expressing an interiority. It's also about like ancestral work and receiving lineages, in particular, right? Afro-diasporic lineages that, you know, have a different, you know, gender resonance, a different gender system. And they're actually, right, it is not a mere cultural practice. And so I do like to think of it that way, right? There are spiritual components that I think have been very much denigrated, right, over time. And whether or not, you know, the TV show was able to tap that, right? I don't know, I'm not a TV scholar, but I think we can tap it. So I share the ambivalence, but feel some love there for at least that it shows us something that is not just social realism, which I think is such a bad genre for trans people. Like, oh, I don't want to see any more realistic representations of our lives. It's too depressing. But also, like, we do more than just suffer, right? There is a magic, and you know, it can come through even in very, very awful circumstances. So yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you for asking. That was a really interesting question too. And I was like, I know that that's been circulating around the internet, like different think pieces going back and forward. So it's really cool to have like your perspective on it too. And from a spiritual perspective, which I think is not as often talked about, especially not in academic spaces, the role of spirituality in gender.
Exactly, yeah.
So did you want to ask?
Mel, did you have anything you wanted to add to that conversation before we would take another audience question?
Oh, you know, I think I would have just added that I think Jules pointing to the need to actually remediate the labor of the kinds of care that trans women do all the time and that support cultural life everywhere is really important. And I'm also just thinking about what it means to give credit. And I feel that the ways that my own practices have been changing are to just make explicit forms of credit and giving credit, thinking about the ways that I have learned so many ways of thinking from my own trans and queer crip of color circles and marking that in ways that I had not been. Yeah, so, and I was thinking just also about the relationships between crip and trans, which I simply wanted to mention here. I don't think we have time to think through that any further. But I also wanted to mark that, you know, I just really appreciate, I did want to mark just all the work that Jules is doing as a public intellectual and sort of making herself present in spaces that feel to me that require a lot of labor as well. And I'm just, I appreciate the work it takes to design an MO that allows for all the powerful voices that you put out there, Jules, in terms of your podcasts, your writing in various kinds of publics that have investments in trans-related discourse that otherwise might turn in a really different direction, as we've seen, you know, happening in this country. So wanted to mark that as well.
Thank you. I mean, one quick thing I can say that I think is very in line with the purpose of this conference, right, is part of why I do that labor, you know, is because I'm able to some extent right now. But you know, more what I really, you know, hoping to do with it is a lot of it is the problem of my one body, right? There's only one Jules at the moment. And, you know, that's not to say am alone in the field. There are many other important people, but there are very few trans scholars with well-paid, high-resource positions, right? And so part of why I'm doing this work more broadly, even outside the academy, is just I want to create the conditions for there to be 100 more of me, because then at that point, I don't have to do that much anymore, which thank goodness, but also because that is why it matters, right? I don't really, I mean, like I love the work I do intellectually, but it's much more important to me to help create the condition in the world for there to be many more people like me, which is to say people who are paid to do this work and who are challenging the absolute lies that are told with us with total impunity every single day. And I think that that's part of what I'm really feeling very emotional about at this conference this year is getting to meet so many of you, right? And understand that we are doing this work together, right? And that is a measurable change, like since I was a graduate student. So for what it's worth, I really think that that matters. And I think that so often many of us are the only trans people in our institution, the only ones in our cohorts. We're often very isolated. We're often marginalized and mistreated routinely in academia. And it matters to know that we are also in the struggle together and that we are doing this for one another, right? I certainly carry that, you know, in everything I do. So yeah. I'm gonna make myself cry if I just.
No, I swear. Like I was like, can we just like cry at 100? But I'm like,
I know, I see you over there.
Yeah, no. It's, I think, especially in the political climate that we're currently experiencing, which is not new, but it's new in the way that it's the extremity and the amount of bills and the rhetoric is like kind of amplified even more. So it's very contentious and it's to feel so trans, you know, like always like embodying and fighting back the internalization of these narratives is a lifelong struggle. And it's a lifelong, so I think like having these spaces that challenge those narratives and say, no, this is like a truth, right? This is one of many truths. And this is like a space where like those other things that are said about our bodies are incorrect, are violent, not based in whatever, you know, so it's, or based in white supremacy and transphobia and all these things. So, and I think that's why the way that these are so scarce, these spaces are so scarce for us is the reason why I think all three of us, and since Sid as well, for us, kind of feel very sentimental and a little bit like it kind of is, it does hit you. We are officially at 1:30 and I'm sad to, you know, see all of this ends for now. But I really wanted to reiterate and just thank both Mel and Jules for being here, and Sid for accompanying me, being present with me in this. Like I was like very nervous as well, like, oh, I'm gonna be here. So I just appreciate your being physically here with me. So, and of course, everybody else here that showed up. And Grace, I don't know if you have any concluding words.
Yeah, wow. Just, you know, adding my thanks to everyone else's. So, you know, of course, thank you, Jules, for, I mean, a absolutely stunning presentation. And of course, to both you and Mel for the very inspiring discussion. And we are so grateful and thrilled that you both agreed to be keynote speakers for our conference. And thank you, Sid and Angel, for facilitating the Q&A and your contributions to the whole conference. So I just want to, you know, emphasize how Sid and Angel, along with RANA, were the visionaries behind this year's conference, and just really wanted to make that very clear. So thank you again to RANA, the selection committee, the co-sponsors, and CSW staff. And you know, thank you so much to all of you for coming. Also, we hope you'll join us again at our special award celebration on May 18th with trans activist Bambi Salcedo, the president of the Trans Latina Coalition, as a keynote speaker. We will be honoring her with the CSW Distinguished Leader in Feminism Award. So thank you so much to everyone.